Have you ever wondered why, no matter where you stand on this earth, the needle always desperately seeks the top of the world? We are taught it is simply magnetism, a blind, physical property of molten iron churning thousands of miles beneath our feet. Dead physics. A mechanical reaction to a spinning core. And we accept this. We accept it because it is what the textbooks tell us, what the diagrams on the chalkboards of our childhoods illustrated with simple, unquestionable arrows. But if you spend enough time looking at the older records, the ones that haven't been summarized and sanitized for general consumption, you begin to notice a quiet, persistent friction between what we are told is at the top of the world and what the needle is actually trying to find. We are told the North Pole is a void, a crushing, shifting expanse of dead ice, a frozen wasteland hostile to life, hostile to memory, hostile to anything but the most extreme endurance. And yet, the compass needle, the tool that has guided human civilization across every ocean, points directly into that void as if it is the only thing that truly matters. What if the needle isn't pointing to a magnetic abstraction? What if it is pointing to an origin? I am not asking you to abandon your reason. I am not asking you to believe in mythical lands or allegories written to comfort ancient people. I am asking you to do something much more difficult. I am asking you to look at the official historical record, to read the logs of the men who actually sailed into those freezing waters, to trace the evolution of our maps, and to notice the exact moment when the world agreed to stop looking. Because when you do, a pattern emerges. A pattern of redaction, of institutional silence, of a very deliberate, very bureaucratic erasure. To understand what was taken from us, we have to go back to the man who gave us the world as we know it. Gerardus Mercator. If you have ever looked at a map, you have interacted with Mercator's mind. He is the undisputed father of modern cartography. His projection, the Mercator projection, created in 1569, allowed sailors to navigate using straight lines. It revolutionized global trade, empire, and exploration. Mercator was not an artist prone to flights of fancy. He was a mathematician, a surveyor, a man whose reputation and livelihood depended on absolute, uncompromising accuracy. When he drew the coastlines of the Americas, of Europe, of Africa, he did so by painstakingly compiling the most reliable, verified accounts of navigators. He did not invent landmasses to fill empty spaces. If he did not know what was there, he left it blank. But when Mercator drew the North Pole, he did not leave it blank. And he did not draw a featureless sheet of ice. In his maps of the Arctic, culminating in the famous 1595 posthumous publication, Mercator depicted a massive, highly specific continent at the very top of the world. He drew 4 massive rivers, perfectly symmetrical, dividing the landmass into 4 distinct islands. And in the very center, exactly at the pole, he drew a colossal mountain. He called it the Rups Nigra, the Black Rock. A magnetic mountain of staggering proportions, from which the world's oceans flowed inward, pulled by a massive central vortex. For decades, I looked at this map and dismissed it the way modern historians dismiss it, as a borrowing from classical mythology, a rare lapse in judgment from a man who otherwise demanded empirical proof for every incline he laid down. But that explanation never fully settled. It requires us to believe that the most meticulous geographer of his age risked his legacy to draw a fairy tale in the most important location on the globe. It wasn't until I began reading Mercator's personal correspondence that the foundation of the official narrative began to crack. In a letter dated 1577, written to the English scholar John Dee, Mercator explains exactly where he got the information for his polar map. He did not invent it, he did not dream it. He copied it from a lost narrative called the Inventio Fortunata, a document detailing the journey of a Franciscan friar from Oxford who had traveled the northern islands in the 1300s. Mercator writes that this friar had mapped the region using an astrolabe, that he had physically measured the indrawing currents, that he had documented the specific tribes living on the outer islands. Mercator describes the central mountain not as a myth, but as a measured geographic reality. A magnetic center so powerful it dictated the currents of the global oceans, and for over a century, this was the accepted geography of the world. The greatest minds of navigation believed the pole was a vibrant, moving, energetic center, a place of deep, rushing waters and magnetic resonance. And then, slowly, the maps began to change. Not because a definitive expedition had marched to the pole and proven Mercator wrong, but because the institutions that funded exploration began to standardize what was acceptable to print. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, the four islands vanished. The Rupes Nigra was scrubbed, the indrawing rivers were erased. In their place, a vast, white emptiness was imposed. They painted the maps white, not discovered to be ice, declared to be ice. There is a profound difference. When you declare a space to be dead, you discourage anyone from looking for life. But the men who actually sailed the northern latitudes during this transition period, the whalers, the early naval officers, the independent explorers, they kept seeing things that the new, white maps told them were impossible. This is where the historical record becomes incredibly difficult for the mainstream consensus to manage. Because these weren't theorists sitting in armchairs in London or Paris. These were practical, hardened sailors whose survival depended on reading the environment accurately. If you read the raw, unedited logs of the northern whaling fleets from the 1800s, a strange consistency appears. As they pushed further north, past the established ice barriers, expecting the cold to deepen and the ice to thicken, they frequently encountered the opposite. They reported a sudden, inexplicable warming of the air. They documented winds blowing from the absolute north that were not biting and frigid, but noticeably warm. How does a warm wind blow from a place that is officially designated as the coldest, most frozen point on Earth? Where was the heat coming from? The anomalies compound. Multiple independent expeditions, including those of the mid-19th century American explorers Elisha Kent Kane and Isaac Israel Hayes, reported encountering what became known as the open polar sea. After brutal, deadly journeys through the ice pack of Baffin Bay and the Kennedy Channel, they reached a point where the ice simply ended. They described looking out over a vast, iceless, rolling ocean stretching directly toward the pole, teeming with marine life, with temperatures visibly rising. Their observations were documented. They were presented to geographical societies, and they were systematically, methodically dismantled by the academic authorities who had never left Europe. Kane and Hayes were accused of misinterpreting mirages. They were told that their thermometers must have been broken. They were told that what they saw could not exist, because the consensus had already decided that the North was solid ice. But the biological evidence is even harder to dismiss than the geographic. Explorers consistently noted massive flocks of birds, specific species of gulls and waterfowl flying directly north as winter approached. Let that sink in. Animals whose entire biological imperative is survival, whose migratory instincts are honed over millennia to flee the freezing temperatures, were observed abandoning the southern routes and heading straight into the supposed frozen void of the high Arctic. Foxes and bears were tracked moving north over the ice as the darkness fell. What were they walking toward? Instinct does not drive animals to march into a wasteland to starve. Instinct drives them toward warmth, toward shelter, toward food. They were migrating to a biosphere that our maps say does not exist. And then there are the reports of the snow itself. Early explorers frequently noted falling snow tinted with colors, red, green, and yellow snow, sometimes falling for days. Modern science quickly explains this away as algae or atmospheric dust. But the men who collected it, who analyzed it on their ships, often noted that it contained massive amounts of pollen, floral pollen, floating down from the extreme north, covering the ice in the dead of winter. Pollen from what flowers? Forests of what kind? If the north is a static, dead sheet of frozen water, where is the biological material originating? The deeper you pull on these threads, the more you realize that the Arctic was not a quiet, empty place. It was loud with anomalies. It was vibrating with evidence of a massive, active, warm ecosystem situated exactly where Mercator had drawn his inner world. And then, at the dawn of the 20th century, the era of independent exploration abruptly ends. We enter the era of the formalized, militarized, institutional expeditions. This is the period that textbooks celebrate: Peary, Cook, Byrd, the heroic age of polar exploration. But when you examine how these expeditions were structured, who funded them, and how their data was managed, you see a completely different architecture. You see the closing of the perimeter. Around 1912, a subtle but absolute shift occurs in global policy. It coincides with the tightening of international treaties, the shifting of maritime laws, and the sudden unified agreement among competing empires that the polar regions must be managed through strict governmental oversight. Think about the geopolitical landscape of the early 1910s. The world is accelerating toward the most devastating global conflict in human history. Nations are fiercely competing for resources, for territory, for technological advantage. Britain, America, Russia, Germany, they disagreed on almost everything. They fought over mere miles of borders in Europe and Africa. And yet, regarding the extreme polar regions, they arrived at a remarkable, unspoken consensus. The narrative of the frozen dead wasteland was codified. The independent explorers were pushed out, discredited, or denied funding. Only military or heavily vetted institutional expeditions were allowed to define the reality of the poles. Why? What does it serve to lock down a supposed wasteland? The official explanation is always safety and sovereignty. But the evidence suggests something else. It suggests that what was at the pole was not just geography, but a paradigm, a physical, energetic reality that threatened the very foundation of the world they were trying to build. We have to look at the transition happening in the civilized world during this time. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw the complete consolidation of the industrial, fossil fuel-based economy. The families and institutions that engineered this era built their power on a very specific philosophy: scarcity. To control a global population, you must make them dependent. You must make them believe that energy is finite, that it must be extracted from the dirt through grueling labor, that it must be meted out, metered, and paid for. You must convince humanity that life is a harsh, brutal struggle against a cold and indifferent nature. But what if Mercator was right? What if the Rupes Nigra was not just a rock, but the central node of a planetary electromagnetic grid? What if the four rivers were not just water, but the circulatory system of a self-sustaining, infinitely renewable biosphere? An Eden not in the biblical, metaphorical sense, but in a purely physical, energetic sense. A place where the Earth's frequency creates a perfect, temperate, naturally abundant environment. If such a place existed, and if the knowledge of its mechanics was available to the public, the entire architecture of the industrial world would collapse overnight. You cannot sell coal to a world that understands how to pull energy from the ambient ether. You cannot force a man into a factory for 14 hours a day to buy synthetic medicine if he knows there is a biosphere on this very planet that heals cellular decay simply through its resonant frequency. You cannot govern a world that knows it has an endless heart. The erasure of the North Pole was not a cartographic error. It was a psychological operation. It was the severing of humanity from its own source. They took the magnetic center of our world, the place where all lines of longitude meet, the place that literally anchors the physics of our reality, and they told us it was a dead end. They told us there is nothing there to see. And the tragedy is, we believed them. We stopped looking. We turned our attention to the smokestacks, to the stock markets, to the endless, exhausting cycle of artificial scarcity. We accepted the white void on the map, and in doing so, we allowed a white void to be drawn over our own intuition. There is a profound, lingering grief in the modern human condition. A feeling that we are alienated from the earth we walk on. We treat nature as a hostile force to be conquered, or a fragile victim to be pitied. We have forgotten that we were designed to resonate with a living, intelligent system. The anxiety, the chronic illness, the deep, nameless exhaustion that characterizes modern life is not a failure of our biology. It is the symptom of a profound geographical and spiritual dislocation. We are living on the periphery of our own planet, convinced that the center is dead. I have spent years reading the suppressed logs, tracing the anomalous currents, looking at the paths of those birds flying north into the dark. I have watched how carefully, how systematically the institutions have mocked and marginalized anyone who asks why the ice ends where it shouldn't. I don't know exactly what sits at the 90th parallel today. I cannot tell you if the four rivers still run, or if the black rock still hums with the pristine frequency of the old world. Perhaps the ice has truly covered it, a natural quarantine brought on by the trauma we have inflicted on the rest of the biosphere. Or perhaps it is exactly as it always was, hidden behind militarized zones and satellite blackouts, a pristine sanctuary kept off the books by the very people who tell us there is nothing to find. But here is what I know with absolute certainty. The act of erasure always leaves a scar. And the scar, in this case, is the massive, irreconcilable body of evidence left behind by the men who saw too much before the doors were locked. The warm winds, the pollen on the snow, the open seas, the frantic redactions in the Admiralty archives. You don't spend a century building an airtight narrative around a block of ice. You only build a fortress around something you fear. We may not be able to book a ship and sail into the open polar sea. We may not be able to verify the Rupes Nigra with our own eyes. But the realization of what was hidden from us is, in itself, an act of profound reclamation. It changes how you view every authority that claims to have the final word on human limits. When you realize that the most fundamental geography of our world has been curated to keep you small, you stop asking for their permission to expand. You don't need to fight the institutions. You don't need to scream at the empty maps. You only need to quietly, stoically, reclaim the knowing inside yourself. They can redact the logs, they can alter the satellites, they can rename the geography, but they cannot alter the fundamental physics of the human soul. The needle still points north. Deep in our cellular memory, we remember the warmth, we remember the frequency, we remember the Eden that was stolen from the paper. We are magnetic beings, walking a magnetic earth. And no matter how much white ink they pour over the center of the world, our internal compass will never, ever forget the way home. Keep your compass clear. The maps are changing again.